Hello everyone, welcome to this video on quantifying culture. So if you haven't already, you will want to watch the video on understanding culture first, where we look at exactly how we can define national culture, different expressions of culture, as well as to what extent understanding culture can help us understand institutional, group and individual behavior. So moving on from that, we're going to be looking at ways that we can actually quantify or measure culture. So this is by its very nature extremely difficult. The exact makeup and blend of elements that constitute each culture is very much unique. So we can only go so far when it comes to measuring culture. We ultimately will always need to have a qualitative understanding of culture as well as a quantitative understanding, but it does help us when it comes to making comparisons between cultures, and in particular understanding the cultural distance or the differences between cultures. Cultures with a higher amount of distance between them will require more adaptation to cross that bridge. Cultures with a low amount of distance between them are easier to cross, are easier for companies and people from one culture to cross over into another culture where there's a small amount of distance. So even though we can't really measure culture in a real meaningful sense of really understanding and capturing the essence of the culture, it's still useful for us when it comes to making comparisons between cultures. There's two very useful models that we can apply, Hofstede and Trompernaz. We are going to look at Hofstede in this video, but please do look into and research Trompernaz, which gives a very similar set of dimensions but with a different focus and different formulations. But if we start with Hofstede's dimensions of culture, we are currently at 6 dimensions, with the 6th being added relatively recently, so it has grown and evolved since Professor Hofstede first proposed this model many decades ago, and it's a useful way of trying to isolate different elements of each culture in order to give them ratings of high, medium and low typically. So what we're going to do in this video is really go through each of these 6, which are power distance, uncertainty avoidance, masculinity versus femininity, individualism versus collectivism, long-term versus short-term orientation, and the 6th, indulgence versus restraint. We're going to go through each of these dimensions individually to try and build up an understanding of exactly how they apply and how we can measure and identify expressions of each of these dimensions. So if we start with the first, which is going to be power distance, this effectively talks about the way and attitudes and the way power is understood within that particular culture. So high power distance cultures have a high degree of acceptance that power is distributed unequally, and there will be greater distance between the decision makers within that society and ordinary people. So if we consider a culture like Russian culture, where there is significant rigid hierarchy, there's relatively low mass participation in decision making, and therefore we can ascribe Russia with a high power distance dimension within Hofstede's model. By contrast, if you look at a society like Switzerland, where there is much lower power distance, there's far less rigid hierarchy, and probably most importantly, there is far greater mass participation in decision making. So the distance between the actual power bases and decision makers within society and ordinary people within that society are far lower in Switzerland than they are in Russia. So we would give Switzerland a rating of low power distance within Hofstede's model. It's important that we don't mistake mass participation in decision making as a proxy for whether that society is democratic or not. There will be, so Russia, for example, has elections. It has both local, regional, and national elections, as does Switzerland, but the existence of elections doesn't mean that there is lots of mass participation in actual decision making. Elections are a form of choosing representatives, so democratic countries can have high decision making participation, but that's through the actual form of the elections, the governance system. Switzerland has things like frequent referendums, direct participatory democracy. Its local councils have a high degree of decision-making powers. So all of those things will give us an understanding of the power distance in society. The existence of elections themselves is really not sufficient in making a determination about power distance. We also have societies where formalized elections may be absent, but through things like participatory democracy, deliberative democracy, there may still be very high participation in actual decision making. So it is to do with the distance between the real decision makers and executors of decisions and ordinary people within that society. Right, so if we move on to the next one, which is uncertainty avoidance, and this is really trying to identify and quantify the degree of risk and uncertainty, or really how comfortable individual members of that culture are with risk and uncertainty. So if you have a society with a low uncertainty avoidance score, that means that they already are comfortable with taking risk, comfortable with ambiguity and uncertainty, and therefore will be a risk-taking, flexible society in general. This is highly associated with entrepreneurial cultures, where risk-taking, investments, and flexibility are really prized and valued. So we can look at societies such as the US as having a low uncertainty avoidance score, whereas in other societies where risk-taking and uncertainty are still present, because remember, risk-taking is really part of the human experience, and everyone takes risks to a degree, but there will be less comfort with risk-taking, so more ambiguity results in discomfort and a degree of uncertainty avoidance. So we still have risk takers, we still have entrepreneurial companies, but is not either as prized or is not something which is quite as widespread and accepted. So there is a bit of a subtlety when we look at this. We shouldn't associate this with positive or negative attributes. It's simply a measurement of how comfortable members of that culture are with ambiguity and uncertainty. And there's always going to be a range, but if we look in the aggregate, if we look at the culture and the society surrounding it, then we can draw broad conclusions from it rather than trying to ascertain individual comfort levels. So that was our second dimension. If we move to the third dimension, which is masculinity versus femininity, well, it's really important here to highlight that this has not got anything to do with gender. This has not got to do with gender roles or how men and women function in that culture, but rather is got to do with what things or what attributes are seen as praiseworthy and positive, and which things are socially valuable. So masculine cultures, and we can see Hofstede coming from a particular, so these are quite a few decades old, and we can see that there's a certain amount of gender roles and gender reading into naming these masculinity versus femininity, but to be honest, you can replace the names with anything else and they would still hold true. So according to Hofstede, masculine culture is one that stresses material success, so financial or economic success, assertiveness and achievement, whereas feminine cultures, again, the naming is unfortunate in today's age, but you can see what Hofstede's trying to get at. A culture with low masculinity and high femininity rewards modesty, expressions of care and overall quality of life rather than material success and achievement. So what we're looking at with this dimension is very much examining which things within society are seen as praiseworthy, which things are seen as things to strive for and achieve, and they are two quite distinct groups of elements. So moving on to the fourth dimension, which is individualism versus collectivism. We covered this in quite a bit of detail in week 2 when we looked at political systems. So it's in the political systems video. So everyone should be relatively familiar with it. And again, like the other dimensions, this is looking at broadly the trends and influences within society rather than some kind of programmatic determinant factor of individual attitudes. But individualist societies will generally tend towards prioritizing individual freedom of action and individual decision making, whereas collectivism prizes the interests of the collective and therefore the interests of the group above the more narrowly defined interests of the individual. So if we move on to the fifth now, which is long-term versus short-term orientation. Now, this is a little bit subtle. We do have to take a bit of time to consider this. This has got to do not with necessarily long-term or short-term actions, but rather long-term versus short-term understanding of time. So it's a time horizon within society. So countries with a long-term orientation would have a long-term time horizon, their understanding of time and their understanding of future consequences and the impacts of actions stretch out over a longer period of time. So we tend to see pragmatic, modest and thrifty values coming to the fore, and we can see that contrasted with short-term orientations where the time horizon is shorter, and instead of a pragmatic approach we see an emphasis on principles, consistency and the truth. So we're looking at the difference between the impact of actions for a long-term orientation versus the truth or rightness of actions with countries with a short-term orientation. And we do have the addendum that short-term orientated countries or cultures tend to have a higher degree of religious and nationalistic feeling. So I think that would be a one way to distinguish between the two, whether we're looking at the impact of actions and their overall utility versus looking at the correctness, the truth, or the accuracy of actions, or the rightness of actions in a country with a short-term orientation. So if we move on to our sixth and last dimension in Hofstede's model, we have indulgence versus restraint. So here this is looking at the degree of constraints on individuals' actions and the social norms surrounding those restraints or relative lack of restraints. So for high indulgence cultures, we have the social acceptance of relatively free gratification of people's drives and emotions. So we can see that in, for example, Western European countries, whereas in high restraint cultures, we have greater social restraint and social norms around suppressing gratification in order for other values or other benefits, and therefore greater regulation of conduct and behavior of individuals. So this can be quite closely correlated with individualistic and collectivist cultures. So and again, the reason why I want to stress that connection there is because in high restraint cultures, suppressing gratification isn't a good unto itself, it's not a value unto itself, but it's there for some kind of broader goal or broader good, and in many cases this is the interests of the collective over the interests of the individual. Whereas in high indulgence cultures, the gratification of people's drives and emotions and desires is not linked or connected to negative consequences for the collective. So we have a distinction there and a correlation between individualistic and collectivist dimensions of culture also. So that covers our 6 dimensions. Like I said, you also have alternatives to Hofstede in Trompenaar and others. And what these dimensions really do is not give you a perfect understanding of the culture. To really have a deep understanding of a particular culture, we need to look at it in a qualitative sense rather than trying to quantify specific dimensions. But it is very helpful in us in developing an understanding of a culture, and more importantly, allows us to make a comparison of different cultures. And that will allow us to understand the distance between different cultures, i.e., essentially the degree of difference between different cultures, and therefore the degree of potential cultural misunderstanding, the degree of adaptation that's required by individuals and companies trying to operate in the other culture, and that's very useful for us.